Ever since Velodrome and Aerodrome were introduced into the DEX market, they have been slowly but surely siphoning away volume from Uniswap. Now, Uniswap is the swap OG DEX. This is essentially where most of the volume on-chain was being made. It was originally launched on Ethereum, but then it went multi-chain, and they do have lots of deeper liquidity pockets, so to speak. So remember, they are the first ones, and they were the ones who came up with the first model, then upgraded it, then brought in the concentrated liquidity model that so many other DEXs have implemented, including the likes of Velodrome and Aerodrome. Now, they did build their own, mimicking whatever Uniswap did, with of course few tweaks, few changes, etc. But at the end of the day, the Uniswap universal router has been implemented by so many DEXs, and potentially the majority of DEXs. Now, what's different here is that one, these two DEXs, so Velodrome and Aerodrome, are specifically on Optimism and on Base. So they are solo chain. And their model is different. So the V33 model has been introduced, and potentially this model is much more decentralized than whatever Uniswap has in place, and the best model out there in my personal opinion, but because it does embody the best out of both worlds. So it does give value to the asset, to the token of the platform, and it does reward liquidity providers. Whereas, for example, Uniswap, they do have their governance token, which unfortunately is very tied to the whole of the market. So it's a speculative token right now. It has nothing really, tied to it other than potentially being used as collateral somewhere. And maybe if a bill passes, then it could become a staking. It would become part of a staking contract where people would stake their Uni tokens and earn a portion of the platform fees. But that is, because of regulations, something that I wouldn't expect anytime soon. And not only this, there are similarities, sure, but there are also differences that make Aerodrome, for example, in my personal opinion, a better DEX for now in terms of liquidity providers and in terms of swaps. But remember, I'm talking about Base, I'm talking about Optimism. Because for me, if I want to do any trade anywhere else, for example on Arbitrum, I would use Uniswap directly if the liquidity pool is there. Unless it's not, then I have to use elsewhere. But overall, most LPs on these other chains choose Uniswap as their first target of DEXs. Now, liquidity routing is something that, in my opinion, Aerodrome does better, for example, and it's the idea of when you want to swap, for example, you get better rates there than you would on Uniswap. To give you an example, right now, if I want to switch between ETH and USDC, that is the rate that you're seeing, right? So 2,408 per ETH. Now, if you do the same on Aerodrome, I'm going to refresh it right now, you will potentially have a better rate. But let's figure this out for ourselves, because essentially what Aerodrome does is in the background, they try to find the best route possible using all of their liquidity pools. So every liquidity pool that has ETH within it is included in the search process. Whereas Uniswap firstly targets the ETH USDC pool, and this is where it fetches you the price from. Here, the process is a bit different. And because of this, essentially you would get a better price point when you want to swap assets. For example, here, as you can see, it's 2,414. So there's a $6 difference. If you're doing 10 ETH, that's $60 that you would but you would realize on Aerodrome versus Uniswap. Now, add on top of this the cost effectiveness of these swaps, because essentially what's happening, like I said, that router is pulling from all liquidity pools, and at the end of the day, you're only paying gas fees for one seamless transaction. You're not doing two swaps from A to B, then from B to C. You're simply just moving from A to B, and the rest is happening in the background. And because of Slipstream's cost effectiveness status, you wouldn't have to pay extra, versus if you were doing the same on Uniswap, you would have to swap manually from A to B, then from B to C, then you're paying double. So this is something that, in my personal opinion, gives the concentrated liquidity model of Aerodrome a head start over the Uniswap CL model. And not only this, if you're adding liquidity, for example, using Slipstream, it's a bit more seamless and straightforward in terms of what you would expect, because one, you're getting emissions in Aero, you're not getting fee rewards unless you don't stake your liquidity, then you would. So you are basically given the idea of what potentially is that you'll be getting, because here, if you do this, you can choose immediately the type of range you want to set, and it gives you the approximate APR. Or you can go custom and do this yourself by adding or removing ticks, and then you'll get also the expected APR range in Aero tokens, of course. But on Uniswap, for example, you have to come to pool, then you have to, or you can go to explore, and then you will see the pools, and then the potential return will basically be based on whatever happened in the last 24 hours. So it's a bit hard to guess, because on high volume days you'll get more fees, vice versa. Now you can guesstimate an average, but it's a bit more hard to predict. So if you choose any pool, for example, then you would go to add liquidity on that pool, then it wouldn't be as seamless, because first, they wouldn't give you the expected range, meaning they wouldn't show you +1, -1, +2, -2. You will have to set this up yourself. As you can clearly see, you choose 2 assets on the top, then you put the price range, and then you adjust it yourself. And because of this, it doesn't immediately adjust the ratio for you. You have to swap to make up the difference if you want to choose a specific ratio. So there's a bit of manual work, on top of whatever else you would need to do. And speaking of rebalancing, because that's a big problem for concentrated liquidity pools, right now Velodrome has implemented its own tool to do so. It hasn't migrated to Aerodrome yet, but it will, meaning if you want to add liquidity there, all you have to do is choose the auto rebalancing feature. You put in your money, you put in your liquidity, you stake it, and then you're good to go. It will just rebalance by itself. And that's something that unfortunately doesn't exist on Uniswap. There are third-party tools, but remember, there's risk with using these services, and they don't have one in-house. And that's something that also gives an edge to Aerodrome, for example. So it's like them coming in and telling you that we're taking the best out of Curve, Convex, UniV2, UniV3, and putting it all together into this nice, basically, super chain type of DEX, because that's what Velodrome is aiming to be, right? So that's something, in my personal opinion, that again gives the edge to Aerodrome. And the model itself, right? So the fact that you're earning emissions that you can then lock and then earn fees because of those locked emissions, I think makes it overall much more decentralized, because community participation overall is needed to make this work, right? You need incentives to come in, you need lots of trading volume, you need fees to be generated, you need people to commit and lock in their emissions or buy up the token in order to participate. So all of this makes it possible for this to be pretty decently decentralized, and very decentralized, I would add, and earn more overall in terms of a collective versus the likes of Uniswap. So the only thing that potentially I would give Uniswap in this regard is that, first of all, they do have the developers, they do have more money, they do have the tech on their side. So anything new, quote unquote, potentially will come from there. Now, who knows? Maybe Aerodrome will beat them to the punch for V4, but that remains to be seen. And they do have the better UI. So that's something that is uncontested. Their UI is very cool, very seamless, super slick, and very easy to use. They even have an app now. Aerodrome is something else. Their UI is not up to standards of what the protocol is performing, so they need to bring it up there. Unfortunately, that's something that I have raised so many times on their Discord, and I agree, it does need a lot of time and effort to produce a much better UI. Now, they do have their own style in their user interface, but in my opinion, it could be tweaked to become a bit more seamless and a bit easier to use and quicker, right? It lags a lot. Now, of course, with better connection, you'll get better outcome, but with decent connection, Uniswap performs much better than Aerodrome. And that is essentially the takeaway at the end, right? So you need performance as a liquidity provider, you need fees, you need to make a good return. And right now, if you are doing so on based on optimism, these V33 DEXs are your best bet. But that's my opinion. I'm talking about the data, I'm talking about my personal experience and what I have, so far gathered from leveraging both dexes, and it has been a timely process, not gonna lie. It did take me a lot of time overall, lots of tryouts, lots of errors, lots of wins, etc., to come up with the overall conclusion. Now, who knows where we will get from here? Who knows what will happen from here on out? Who's gonna take on the edge? Will Aerodrome and Velodrome go multi-chain through, for example, mirrors of their dexes under different names, or just using those names on other chains? Nobody really knows, but it's interesting that because there is competition, this space, apologies, is evolving overall, and that's something that we need. We need competition because we need favorable conditions for retail, for liquidity providers, for us to all move forward. All right. And last but not least, Aerodrome as well as Uniswap are one of the major players that Numerical leverages. We don't use protocols that are risky, that give potentially higher yield. We do choose places where there's liquidity depth and quote unquote safer. So if you don't know what the project is about, all the links will be below. So check them out, check everything out, because right now the USDC vault has been implemented a cap. So if that vault reaches 100k USDC, nobody else can join in unless somebody else leaves. All right, just be aware. And the returns so far have been ranging from 47% all the way to 62% on USDC deposits. So like I said, you have links below, YouTube videos, glossary, community engagement, feedback, etc. Check everything out and feel free to ask questions if you have them. All right, with that, see you in the next one. Have a good one.